Hello everyone, how are you doing? I hope you're all keeping well on this fair evening. And you're very welcome to today's Junior Cycle Science webinar, which is part of Folens Junior Cycle Expert webinar series. And my name is Conor Walker, and I'm the head of post-primary publishing with Folens Publishers. And not only did I work as the publisher on Essential Science 2nd edition, I also worked with Declan, Seán and Rose on the first edition way back in 2016, so we go back a long way now. I don't think I'm over-egging it, and I don't think I need much introduction, but Declan, Rose and Seán are names I think that are synonymous with science education in Ireland, not only from a teaching point of view. Obviously they've got a long-standing career as teachers, but also as trainers of teachers, and with exam experience and also curriculum development experience, not to mention the fact that they've been long-standing authors also with Folens. So I'm delighted that they're here with us to talk today about a variety of things to do with junior cycle science. But I think what would be of particular interest to teachers is their dissection and review of the Chief Examiner's report and looking at, I suppose, the requirements from an assessment and an examination point of view, and how perhaps some features of essential science tie in with that. So I'm going to jump off the stage very soon and I'll come back at the end, but just to give you a sense of the running order. So very shortly, I'll hand you over to Declan, Rose and Seán, who've got a great presentation for you. Then after that, there'll be a prize draw. And our prize this evening is a luxury hamper. So there'll be lots of lovely things to drink and eat in that. And we'll have one lucky winner of that, and that'll be announced just after the presentation. And then we'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, just before we finish, where we'll answer any questions that you might have about all things junior cycle science related. There's a Q&A button, I believe, down at the bottom of your screen. So if you at any point during the presentation want to ask a question, just click that button, post your question, and we'll address that at the end of the session. If we run out of time, or if we don't have the answer for you on this webinar, rest assured we will address it and come back to you as soon as possible after the webinar itself. So I think that's with it. I'm going to jump off now and I'll hand you over to Declan, Rose and Seán for the presentation. So over to you, Declan, I believe.
Great. Okay, so let's get started. I suppose in every country in the world where courses are assessed at national level by means of terminal exam papers, assessment is really the driving force of what is taught and how it is taught. And so that's why I'm starting the webinar with this well-known phrase. Next slide, please. And if one were to look at the Smart Study Science, which is the revision book accompanying Essential Science, one will recall this particular table, where it summarizes that of the 400 marks awarded by the SEC, 360 marks are for the written exam paper and 40 marks are for the assessment task. And we will be referring to these modes of assessment throughout this particular webinar. Next slide, please. Now, the Chief Examiner's report is a treasure trove of very helpful advice and information. And it was written after the examination for the first time of Junior Cycle Science in 2019. And on page 3 of the Chief Examiner's report, he makes it very clear that he was examining things like scientific knowledge, understanding, the reasoning ability of students, and the problem-solving ability of students. So at the very bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, number 1, we have knowledge. So it is a common misconception that some people may think that the new junior cycle science specification is all about skills. Far from it, as we show you very clearly in the Chief Examiner's report, he emphasizes the importance of scientific knowledge. Next slide, please. Now, what we have done for the examination papers from the SEC is we have divided them up into 10 different types of questions. And the first category of question are questions that test knowledge of key terms and definitions. And you will see some screenshots throughout our presentation marked SEC examination question. And those screenshots are taken from the book because we put SEC exam questions and model answers into the book throughout the various chapters of the book. And we've also included things like exam tips, you know, so whereas they asked for the definition of boiling point, and students had to mention throughout the liquid. They asked for definition of sustainability, the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction. Next slide, please. Okay, more information required on units of length, time, volume, temperature, and so on. Next slide, please. More information required on the names of processes like combustion, respiration, photosynthesis, and so on. Next slide, please. Okay, again, they were asked, what's the difference between a moon and a planet? Students were expected to give a definition of what a moon is and what a planet is. So clearly, definitions and factual information, scientific knowledge are important. Next slide, please. Likewise, show the shape, location, and motion of the moon here in the Earth and space. Precise information required. Next slide, please. Again, in the Chief Examiner's report on page 6, he commented that there was evidence of high levels of knowledge, but lower levels of understanding, application, and analysis. So here they were asked for what's a physical change, what's a chemical change, very clear, precise definitions required. Next slide, please. The second type of category of questions that were asked on the exam papers are where students are asked to draw labeled diagrams or insert labels on a diagram or blanks in a sentence. So, for example, drawing in the activation energy. Next slide. Likewise, draw a label diagram of the experiment to measure the rate of reaction of the rate of production of a particular gas. Next slide, please. The third type of questions where students were asked to complete a table. And again, students need to know their scientific knowledge. So, for example, they need to know the properties of protons, electrons, neutrons. Next slide, please. Okay. Here was a question that caused problems to students. The answer to question 4B required candidates evidence for the conservation of mass. And the marking scheme was very precise. What evidence is there that mass is conserved? And the students had to use the phrase equal numbers of each type of atom. So this really tested their understanding of what a balanced chemical equation was all about. A very good question. Next slide, please. The fourth type of question then was where students were asked to interpret diagram or identify parts in the diagram. So naming the chambers of the hearts and explaining the color coding system. Next slide. Okay, again, the interpretation of particle diagrams. Why are these particle diagrams representing elements? And which of the elements is representing a solid? Next slide, please. Again, the parts of the microscope and the parts of the cell. Again, testing knowledge. Next slide, please. And I'll hand over now to Seán on graphs.
Thanks very much, Declan. So the fifth type of question is questions that ask students to draw graphs and interpret data presented in graphs. When we saw the specification initially, and included with that were some sample assessment items, it was very clear that graphs were going to be much more important in this specification. And looking at the examiner's report, he was kind of saying that students were lacking here in the higher order skills, including applications, analysis, evaluation, synthesis, which is all got to do with graphs. Next slide, please. So for instance, this is kind of a graph which is kind of an unfamiliar context. This is a graph that they wouldn't have done in the lab, probably with 3 different solubility curves, and to interpret that is a higher order skill and requires practice. So next slide, please. So the Chief Examiner's report said students' ability to engage with graphs is important and deserves emphasis. Such skills the student should have are choosing what sort of graph, drawing including the choice of axes and scales, using graphs to extract information, notice trends and patterns, and draw conclusions. It is important that students have experience of engaging with graphs that compare two or more sets of bivariate data. It is also important that students have experience of using graphs that present information in unfamiliar contexts. Next slide, please. So to this end, when, in the first edition, we had a dedicated chapter to graphs, and we just slightly altered it here, like slightly updated it with annotations, which keep students engaged for longer because they can see straight away on the diagram, you know, what exactly we're talking about. So for instance, here I'm talking about anomalous data, and they can see straight away what point I'm talking about. Next slide, please. So throughout the book, we revised graphical techniques. So for instance, here, this is a distance time graph. They can relate the abstract graph to what's happening in reality. And here we keep going, emphasizing the success criteria for drawing a good quality graph. And here again, at this side, we're looking at a graph, how to get data from a graph. And again, through annotation, we're being clear about what is required and how to go about doing it. Next slide, please. Again, we've plenty of practice drawing and interpreting graphs, unfamiliar graphs throughout the book. For instance, here, this is a stone falling. This is and the distance that it falls, and of course it is accelerating. This is a graph in unfamiliar context, and they have to do a calculation on it. The same thing here, where they have to draw a graph and interpret it with the resistance of a light-dependent resistor with distance. Probably wouldn't have time to do that in this specification. Next, please. Again, we've loads of practice of drawing and interpreting unfamiliar graphs. So they'll do it in the textbook, they will do it in the assessment skills book, which is a workbook, or online as well. And here you'll see as well that there's a number of graphs that there is an investigation where they have the graph and they have to interpret the results, like using terms like proportionality, etc. Next, please. Okay, questions that ask students to perform calculations. So here we've got calculations, like example here, calculating volume, calculating density. Next, please. Right, and here we've got a State Exams Commission question, a Sankey diagram where they have to do simple calculation of efficiency. Next, please. Again, we have an Appendix A where the 8 essential equations in physics are just revised, the formula, the page in the textbook, and where they can be accessed in the formula tables booklet, which students are pretty bad at doing because there's probably an abundance of information there. But so long as the information, they may use it. Again, we'll be using the triangle formula to work out how we get a specific variable from these equations. Next, please. So the Chief Examiner's report, he observed that answers to questions also indicated that many candidates struggled to understand the use of compound scientific units. Now, compound scientific units where to use two quantities like gram per centimeter cubed or meters per second or meters per second squared. And he recommends candidates should show their calculation work clearly and complete it fully, not cutting any corners, writing 8/2 instead of 4. And candidates should remember to give the units where relevant, even though if it's not asked. And he really made this point this year because he got half the marks for the units, which was unusual in comparison with previous years. Next, please. So to this end, we have a very systematic method of doing calculations. Write the formula, fill it in, write the answer. And I've said, teaching my own students on a daily basis, it's kind of difficult to get them into this disciplinary mode of doing it. And you'll see this method coming up again and again and again in lots of different contexts. Write the formula, fill it in, write the answer with the units. Okay, next, please. Another point that was pretty badly answered with this concept here of mass, weight, gravity, and as the old test note, it's a difficult topic, but one which has a lot more emphasis in this new specification. So to this end, next slide. So to this end, we have covered it twice. We've covered it once in forces, but we've also covered it again in earth and space. So students have 2 chances. We're going to have to teach this at least twice for students to try to build this concept over a period of time. I find it a difficult topic. Sometimes if you do it a few weeks later, again, and revise it, students tend to get it better a second time. Next slide, please. So so I'll hand over to Rose now, who's going to talk about questions that test students' knowledge of laboratory procedures and apparatus. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and hi, everybody. We're going to start with looking at SEC questions that are based on laboratory work. Here, for instance, factors are asked about in the photosynthesis, the factors affecting photosynthesis. The student could pick their own factor, but the kind of thing then would be what factors that you would keep constant to make sure that it is a fair test. So procedures and scientific method is really important. Next, please. Here's a question of sort of two parts. One where the students are just asked to name the apparatus. This apparatus obviously is used in ecology, and warn students, because sometimes they're inclined to hedge their bets. They're putting in two answers in the hope that at least one of them is right, but they need to realize that the wrong answer is going to negate the correct answer, and therefore they won't get any marks. So accuracy is important when there's a very short answer to the question. The second part here is something that we'll be talking about later again, where the student needs to describe, you know, they have to go into detail and they have to make a number of good points when they're describing it. So if the students are advised to go 1, 2, 3, very often you write down number 1 and that actually reminds you of number 2, which reminds you of number 3, and so on. And what Seán was talking about, we've brought into biology, is where a calculation is asked, and it's probably the only place where a calculation comes into biology on this particular syllabus, to get the frequency. So you put down your equation and then you put in the figures and you show the examiner that you know exactly what you're doing. So you have a good chance of picking up at least some of the marks. Next, please. This is a chemistry question about the reaction between an acid and a base and how the pH changes. And again, the student needs to give a description, a 1, 2, 3 description of the use of either a universal indicator, or of course they could go digital and use a pH sensor. Next slide. Here in physics, I guess there probably is very seldom a big long paragraph type answer in the actual straightforward physics questions, but accuracy is called for a lot. Here they have to name A and V, and also they were asked to circle the switch. And again, to teach the students that you need to be very accurate when you're asked to, you know, to circle something, and don't be trying to put the circle kind of over two things because you don't know which is which. So again, accuracy is looked for. Next slide, please. This is straightforward. Again, investigations, and the student is asked about monitoring, again, the pH changes, and it's straightforward answers. And the chief examiner has actually commented on facts, knowledge and facts being very, very good with the students. Next slide, please. I'm taking the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite experiments, which would be the extraction of DNA. This experiment literally could be done in the kitchen at home. So why bring in DNA and why do the extraction? First of all, in order to properly understand chromosomes and genes, students need to know something about DNA, and also to understand mutations, which are responsible for variation, which is responsible for evolution. They will need to be somewhat familiar with DNA. So thus we have the experiment here. And note, we'll be talking a little bit more about this, that there are call outs to give the procedure down along here, and then in a different color, just giving a little bit of extra information about what's going on. Next slide, please. And it's not a mandatory experiment, I would emphasize that, but it's very easy to do, and it does make the students think about where is this DNA that I'm getting out of these cells. We use kiwi here, that strawberries actually are very, very good as well. And I'm sure you know probably other things that work equally as well. Next slide, please. This is a word of encouragement from the chief examiner, who says that candidates have good understanding of experimental design and the use of standard laboratory equipment and techniques, which really goes to show that science teachers are doing the lab work with their students in order for them to be able to do that. So here, for instance, students would have been asked to draw a label diagram of the arrangement of the apparatus to determine the boiling point of water. You'll note in the book we've brought definitely 21st century, it's digital thermometers that we're using all the time, and hot plates where we can, instead of Bunsen burners from a safety point of view. So I'm now handing back, I think, to Declan.
Great. Next slide, please. Thank you very much, Rose. And the 8th category of question that turns up from the SEC are questions where students are asked to show a detailed understanding of various concepts. And this was a question which actually was a very good question, but wasn't well answered by a lot of students, where they had to justify their answer as to which of the above elements was a liquid at room temperature. So it was important that students mentioned both melting point and boiling point, and they had to have an understanding of both concepts. So students really need to be able to analyze data given to them in tables. Right, next slide there, please. And on the next one here, we see a pedigree chart. And again, it was a question which asked students to analyze the pedigree chart and provide evidence from the diagram that persons 6 and 7 are both carriers. So students needed to have a fundamental understanding of pedigree charts. Next slide, please. Right, this was a question on the periodic table, and it was badly answered. And if you look at page 6 of the chief examiner's report, answers to the question to determine the chemical formula for aluminium chloride were of a generally poor standard. Now, students, in answering that question, they would have got marks even for partial answers. So, for example, of the 12 marks allocated, they'd have got 3 marks if they said aluminium is in group 3. They'd have got another 3 marks if they said chlorine is in group 7. If they worked out that the ratio of aluminium to chlorine is 1:3, they'd have got 3 marks, and then the chemical formula. So it's important that we tell our students that even if they're not sure of the chemical formula, if they try to explain how they attempted to find the chemical formula. And on the next slide, please, we show students in diagrammatic form how to use the periodic table to determine chemical formulas of various compounds. And in fact, this is one of the learning outcomes on the specification. So it's important that they use the periodic table given in the SEC booklet, in the exam paper, figure out chemical formulas and to show how they got the chemical formula. Next slide, please. The 9th type of question is where students had to read a short article and then answer some questions based on the article. This one here particularly dealt with high fiber foods. Next slide, please. And again, arising out of reading the article, they were asked, just ordinary knowledge type questions, type of food that's high in fiber, describing the control experiment that scientists would use, and that was answered quite badly. And on the next slide, please, they were asked, again, examples of how bacteria could have an effect, another example of how bacteria could have an effect on human health, apart from beneficial roles of microorganisms. And next slide, please. Here we reproduce this. It came with the original specification as a sample assessment item, where students had to read a newspaper article and answer questions on it and show whether if their reasoning as to whether or not the article was taken from a scientific journal. Next slide, please. The 10th type of question then are multiple choice questions. Again, we have lots of multiple choice questions throughout the workbook, or what's now called the assessment skills book. We also have lots of them online for teachers to run off. Multiple choice questions are good because they test the higher order thinking skills of students. Next slide, please. And I pass back now to Rose, who's going to talk a bit about how we went reducing the cognitive load, and some updates were included.
Thanks, Declan. Next slide, please. To reduce cognitive load and make learning easier and understanding easier for students, we've done graphics where there's as much information in the graphics. Teachers, certainly teachers that I spoke to regarding the first edition of the book, were saying a little bit text heavy. So we did concentrate on putting as much graphics to make life much easier for everybody. So just for instance, this is a graphic showing the characteristics of life. All 7 of them are in there, and a very brief description, definition, if you like, of each one. Next slide, please. And for diagrams of, say, this is typical, we'll say the plant cell. It has the usual labels there that you can see in black, and then onto that it shows in yellow callouts the function of each of the parts. So instead of having to look at the diagram and the labels and then going to a table maybe across the page, it has it all nice and neatly put together. Visual learners will just love this, and I think most of us have some sort of visual learning capacity in us. Next slide, please. And there are all 4 of the human systems that's on the syllabus. We've done the same treatment of labeling the diagram and putting the functions with it. So here we look at the digestive system, and definitely cognitive load is reduced again. And the Royal Society of Chemistry and the Institute of Physics are promoting easing cognitive load for students in any kind of way, and improving graphics is a major way of doing that. So there's the digestive system. Next slide, please. And the respiratory system. Next slide, please. The human male reproductive system, and next slide, the female reproductive system. Next slide, please. Right, this has to do with examination preparation, as Declan was talking about at the start of the talk, that, like, let's face it, at the end of the day, there's an exam to be covered, and so therefore we're preparing our students. One of the things that the chief examiner spoke about, actually on 2 different occasions, was the fact that students need to practice to produce paragraph length answers, whether it be as a paragraph like we have here in this question on natural selection, or in the case of describing experiments, because okay, it isn't a paragraph, it's points 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., but it's the same sort of idea, points being made in order to gather the marks for the question. And on the left hand side of this slide, you see the way natural selection is treated would be perfect answer for the question on the right hand side. Next slide, please. we decided that we would bring in the pandemic, and not necessarily the pandemic, but the pandemic is taking over our lives, let's face it. There's Professor Luke O'Neill that we're all following and listening to. I think he's brilliant, and he tweeted that cartoon on the left during the week, so he's very cognizant of how we're all doing. And of course our medical people living in this PPE gear that I'm sure they're all losing weight while the rest of us at home are gaining it. Anyway, next slide, please. Now, this is up to the minute. Conor, you can just run on this slide. This is up to the minute information on fighting viruses, because viruses obviously will be part of microbiology, and we've been doing viruses all along, but now they're suddenly kind of taking the front of microbiology at the moment. So a little bit about viruses, their structure, and why hand washing is so effective against them. A little bit about vaccination, which again we would have already been speaking about in the first edition, but a little bit more about how vaccination, in very simple terms, how it causes the body to produce antibodies. Next slide, please. And one of the things, of course, as well, that is very topical is the strict rules and regulations around the development of vaccines. So just giving the students the steps taken, and then particularly the steps taken and the trials that go on before the European Medicines Agency, or in the US, the FDA will allow vaccines to be used. Next slide, please. This is, Declan referred to it already, the pedigree charts, and the book will cover how pedigree charts are made, first of all, how you put it together, the reasoning behind it, and also, it's not here on the slide, but another question as well as the SEC exam question on a pedigree chart is covered as well. Next slide, please. Here, another thing that came up in the Chief Examiner's report was the fact that only 12% of candidates had a concept of what was meant by a control. That was in question 14, to do with the bacteria in the gut and feeding the mice. And feeding the mice the fatty acids made them kind of more resistant to stress. And the question was asked, what control could you use here? And of course, the answer would be that you have a group of mice that don't get fed the fatty acids. But imagine only 12% understood that. So maybe the students, as they are so young, a little bit more emphasis needs to be put on control and what exactly it is. So on the slide there's various experiments, and the control is mentioned in each one. And the very first experiment they come across on testing foods, if you like, a definition of a control used for comparison to show what happens without the experimental treatment. Next slide, please.
Thanks,
and now
Rose.
I'm passing back to Declan.
Great. Thanks, Rose. And again, in the chemistry section, as you can see there, the contrast between the left and the right, we're trying to reduce the cognitive load and appeal to the visual learners who can see the stages much more clearly with the call-outs on the right. Next slide, please. Similarly, we've put a lot more emphasis in the whole area of the particle theory diagrams, because these have clearly been emphasized both on the SABI paper and on the 2019 examination paper. Next slide, please. Here again is another example where we're using callouts to try to tie together the concept of elements, compounds, mixtures, and matter, and showing how they're all interlinked there in that type of diagram. Next slide, please. Here's another example where we're investigating the effect of temperature on solubility. And notice that all these blue boxes are used to summarize the key steps. And again, by the use of callouts and diagrams, which are all labeled, we show students the various steps that we have to undergo. Next slide, please. Again, we've introduced some new experiments for the law of conservation of mass and the balloon and Alka-Seltz tablets. The silver nitrate and sodium chloride in the first edition is still there and it still works perfectly, but this is included in the laboratory notebook accompanying the textbook. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Declan.
And Seán, thanks.
Thank you. So we've this integrated instruction to make material easier to visualize and learn. So 3 reasons we use these callouts: clarity, clarity, clarity. When students are reading a paragraph, they can switch off fairly quickly. But when they can relate the point of information to the diagram, they can visualize it much easier and they can learn it much better. Next, please. So again, enhancements physics section here, we would have, again, as said earlier, we're doing all our calculations in a step-by-step method. Write the formula, fill in the equation, write the answer with the correct unit, consistency throughout. Next, please. Okay, questions more appealing, using additional diagrams where possible. So we were talking about measuring acceleration here, right? And again, it looks quite dull, right? Or measuring speed in this case. So they can visualize maybe a situation where we'd want to use that, or measuring velocity. Next, please. And then the same thing here with acceleration. These are abstract concepts, but maybe with a diagram, it might make a little bit extra sense, makes it easier. The concept of accelerating and decelerating. Next, please. Okay, so electricity now. Some people found the chapter electricity can be quite challenging and it may be quite long. So I've broken it into 2 chapters now, just the basics of electricity. Now, if you wish, you can continue on to the next chapter to complete or else we can do it. We can take a break and do it later. So we just do the very basics of current electricity before we do the different topics here. So again, it just gives you greater teacher choice if you wish to do it that way. Next, please. Okay, so then again, additional diagrams to help students visualize and model various concepts. So we use this idea of a water pump here. Kind of like a bigger battery, bigger voltage, more current of water. The same thing here, constriction pipe represents resistance, less constriction, less resistance. Right, the concept of the moon. If you notice with the moon, all the changes in the moon happen from the left to the right. If it's dark, it gets dark from left to right. After the new moon, right, when it's new, it gets dark from left to right as well. So all the changes of the moon happen from left to right, kind of like a timeline, which they might be more used to, and waxing and waning in context, okay? So again, just annotating it here makes it a bit easier. And then when they get to tables of data, like they mean nothing really to a lot of students, but if you can maybe visually represent it here to show what the table actually means, that the vast difference between the planets. Next, please. So okay, so again, the energy conversions, just clarity here and all interrelated. Next, please. Again, diagrams here with matching photographs. So the abstract diagram is made more concrete here. So what does this mean? It's a switch, this is a battery, this is a bulb, and to see what these things actually mean. Just makes it clearer with the annotations as well. Next, please. Same thing here when you're going into the second chapter of electricity, we revise the first one using annotations, voltage, current, resistance. Right, if they know that, really they have got 90% of the electricity done. Next, please. Okay, same thing here. Again, we've got the photograph, which actually what it looks like in reality, and here the circuit diagram to know what it means. Okay, next, please. Okay, Sankey diagrams, annotation, what every part means. Next, please. Okay, the same thing here, overcoming common misconceptions and errors that we've marked thousands of exams over the years and read State Exams Commission, marking schemes and talked to examiners and all this kind of thing. So again, lots of things like what's the use of a graduate cylinder? A lot of students would say to measure a liquid. Now, it's to measure the volume of liquid. These are common misconceptions. Things here like success criteria to explain how the moon is orbiting around the Earth. It must be round close to the Earth and the sun and orbiting the Earth. And lots of little hints and tips as we go along just to show students, look, this is where people went wrong and this is how you can correct that. Next, please. So I'll pass back to Declan now, who's going to talk about the Science and Society Assessment Task. Thank you.
Thanks, Seán. And just a few final points to wrap up. We decided that we would devote a full chapter on the Science and Society Assessment Task because we now have a very clear indication of what exactly is required. And this chapter 40 includes the SEC booklet with model answers written in to give students an idea of what would be best practice in order to get full marks. And the assessment skills book also contains the blank SEC booklet. Next slide, please. And in this slide, you can see the double page spread in chapter 40, with all the basic stuff like primary data, secondary data, how to devise a research question for the science and society assessment task. Next slide, please. And in the next slide, we see that students have a work example here where we guide them through how to fill out the SEC booklet for their particular science and society investigation. We just took one example, our research question: to what extent do electric cars contribute to improving the quality of air? And you can see there the amount of blue writing. I marked for many years junior cycle science exam papers before going up the Leaving Cert, and the most common problem we had was that students do not write enough. So we're trying to show them here what is considered best practice to get the top mark. Next slide, please. Inside then, in the assessment skills book, Folens have reproduced the entire assessment task booklet to give students practice in filling out the assessment task that they've carried out. Next slide, please. We have a complete chapter on the extended experimental investigations. We put it as chapter 1, the last chapter in the book, to allow teachers to access it easily, because different people will, tackle the CBA one at different stages during second year, for example. And we also have a blank template. And on the next slide, you will see that the extended experimental investigations, everything covered about variables and how to write a hypothesis. I'll come back to that in a moment. And on the next slide, please. On the next slide, how to carry out an experiment, testing the hypothesis, independent, dependent variables, and so on, and a reliability of results. And next slide, please. We have a blank template. It's an editable Word format also on the Folens website, where students can write up their extended experimental investigation. And next slide. Interestingly, on the next slide, the Chief Examiner's report tells us that students had difficulty in writing hypothesis, that many of them, when they were asked to write a hypothesis, wrote a question, whereas a hypothesis, of course, is a statement. So in helping students write how to write a hypothesis, on the next slide, please. When writing this chapter, what I did was I told them, when writing a hypothesis, use an if-then statement. So I think that if I do something, then something else will happen, and give them many examples of research questions and how to write the hypothesis. Next question, please. In order to help them get practice in writing various hypotheses, I've given them 10 examples there in question 41.3 of research questions, and they have to write a hypothesis for each one of these. Right. Next question, please. The next slide, please, rather. Brad. What else have we? Lots more videos. I know with the online learning that teachers love to have videos available, and for many of us, videos were our lifeline in teaching practical work online. So we have lots more videos on the way, not only containing the student experiments, but also containing lots of teacher demonstration experiments. Next slide, please. Nearly finished now. Okay, we also have a teacher's guide with background information for the busy teacher on all of the strands of the specification, details of all the apparatus that you need to order, the chemicals required, how to make up all the chemicals, work solutions and answers to every question in the textbook and workbook, lots of examples of open-ended investigations. If you're looking For example, we've compiled all the ones set by the SEC for the coursework B investigations, and also we have schemes of work and units of work made out for teachers. Next slide, please. In chapter 13 of the Teacher's Guide, we have the 3 years schemes of work made out for you according to each year and divided up into units of work. Next slide, please. And in the Teacher's Guide, we have each unit numbered. There's 2 hours class contact, so it's about a week's work for each topic. We suggest what topic you should cover, where it's covered in the second edition, how it links in with the nature of science, which has to be embedded throughout the book, of course, and then suggested student laboratory practical work that we have in the laboratory notebook. This runs to something like 12 pages, so everything for the busy teacher. Again, it's available as a Word document online if you want to modify it to your own requirements. If, for example, you're having a whole school inspection or a subject inspection, then it's a ready-made package there for you. Next slide, please. Okay, we have loads of teachers' resources for the teacher. You know, we have lots of updated material on the extended experimental investigations. We have lots of editable PowerPoint online for teachers who are very busy and who haven't time to be preparing lots of PowerPoints. Lots of worksheets online for class tests, save you making out the class tests yourself, and lots of references to very many YouTube videos that we found useful in writing the teacher. Next slide, please. Okay, we also have lots of online worksheets for every chapter in the textbook. These will be questions that the pupils wouldn't have seen, so you can use them for tests. Next slide there, please. Okay, so in conclusion, what have we got? We have a full chapter on drawing and analysing graphs. We have the science and society assessment task in chapter 40. We have the extended experimental investigations in chapter 41. We have the student lab notebook with all the key experiments. You know, the videos produced by Folens, lots of resources, lots of exam tips built in throughout the textbook, and the blue box is summarising all the key points. And in conclusion, could I firstly thank you all for coming to our webinar tonight, and secondly, to thank you for making the first edition of Essential Science so successful and so popular the length and breadth of Ireland. We thank you for putting your faith in us and putting your trust in us, and we will not let down that faith and trust. So I'll hand you back now to our host, Conor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Declan. Thank you very much, Rose, and thank you also, Seán. I won't, I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to fire through these few slides and then we'll come to the question and answer section, which we've received a lot of questions from teachers who have joined us this evening, which is fantastic. I'm not sure whether I'll have an opportunity to get through everything, but we'll get through as much as we can within the time allotted. So there's a wide range of sample resources available for you to take a look on folens.ie. If you go into folens.ie and search for Essential Science Second Edition, that will take you to a link to a web page where you can review the various resources available for the program. Somebody asked whether the ebook is on Folens Hive. That won't be going up on Folens Hive until later on this summer, but there is a flip book available of the book. So it's an online version of the book which you can flick through on that website, similar for the assessment skills book and the teacher's guide and the various other PowerPoints that we have. So please, if you've got more, if there's more that you'd like to see about the second edition, go to folens.ie.
Are you muted there, Conor?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was on mute. Was I on mute for the last slide as well?
No, just for this one, Conor.
Okay, apologies. So if you would like to contact your rep to discuss the book further and the teaching package further, they're available for calls at any time that suit you. We obviously support book rental schemes, and there are also samples that we can provide to you should you require them. So if you go on to folens.ie and if you enter your school roll number, you will then be returned the name and contact details of the rep who you should contact, and they'll be able to help you. Okay, so the prize draw, I tend to do a little drum roll for this, but we have a winner, and it is Gourmet Hamper goes to Deirdre Ward, who teaches at Loreto Community School in Milford in beautiful Donegal. I've actually been to that school, lovely part of the world. So congratulations, Deirdre. We will be in contact with you, I think, with you via email to organize delivery of that. Okay, I'm just going to throw my camera on. Hopefully you can see me now. There's a couple of questions that we have. Again, as I said, well, there's quite a lot. I'm not sure whether we'll manage to get through them all, but I'll try to start and filter them from the more general questions down to the quite specific questions that we have about the various strands and things like that. So there's just a general question here about why we've published a second edition of Essential Science. I might, as the publisher, can give my response to that, and then maybe Declan, Rose, or Seán, if you'd like to comment on it. But basically, I suppose, with it being 5 years since the implementation of the new specification, and while the first edition of Essential Science was very much in line with that, I suppose with the sample paper from the SEC and from the examination, the actual examination itself in 2019, along with developments on other sides of assessment, such as the assessment task, CBA, and so on, we felt it was a good time to provide those updates and include those updates in the book. I don't know, Declan, would you have a view, or is there anything else in terms of the second edition that we've addressed? I suppose as well, we did get a lot of feedback from teachers whereby we wanted to incorporate that feedback into the new publication too.
Rose?
Yes, I was, Declan, you're mute. We'll keep him quiet for a while.
Okay,
I would have said everything that you said there, Connor, and it would be essential to say that the first edition covers the spec just perfectly. So we've gone better in the sense that we now know more about the exam style, the type of questions that we've gone through already, and of course the CBAs, and particularly the Science and Society one, we know what's needed now, whereas we were all blind at the start when we were publishing or writing the books and making our way as best we could. And the exam showed that we definitely hit the spot, but now it's improved an awful lot. And personally, I would have taken on board talking to teachers and feedback from teachers about how it could be improved. And I think one of the big features of it is the fact that there is less text and more graphics.
great, thank you. Thank you, Rose.
Seán or Declan want to say anything else?
Oh. Next question.
Okay. There's another question here that asks about why have you included a lab book in the teaching package?
Yeah, could I take that? I must say I'm a great lover of laboratory notebooks, because firstly, from the point of view of safety, if a student is carrying out experiments and you're trying to build up their practical skills, they need to have a clear set of instructions in front of them of what to do. They shouldn't be running back to wonder, what do I do next? So number one, for safety purposes. Number two, it saves teachers an awful lot of time producing worksheets for students, you know. So having everything in the lab notebook is very convenient. And also, of course, it gives great structure to student practical work and making sure that they can write up the experiment according to particular headings. And we saw there in the Chief Examiner's report that teachers were praised that students had developed these skills very well. and were able to describe experiments and draw diagrams of apparatus that they use to measure things like rates of reaction. So there's a very strong case for a laboratory notebook, and of course, they're very popular among teachers also.
And Declan, just a query, just I suppose, within the book itself, there's a question in relation to the amount of space that's there for students to write into the lab book. Do you feel in the second edition there's sufficient space to do that? Obviously, the more limited space you have, it maybe implies that students don't write out their step-by-step procedures in full.
Yeah, you see, in designing the laboratory notebook, we're very conscious that it's only junior cycle, and we don't expect pages upon pages of laboratory reports, because in an examination, they can get a lot of marks for well-drawn labeled diagrams. So we try to restrict the amount of writing to, say, a page. We feel if they can get everything onto one page, we're doing very well. And if they run short of pages, there are always few blank pages that can be made available at the back, you know, that they can slot in, or they can use some of the blank pages at the back. So we feel that we've got it about right, looking for one page per experiment.
And it kind of forces students to think a bit more what they're doing, so they're copying reams of stuff. They have to actually synopsize what they're doing, and it causes them to think a little bit more. Okay, so next question.
Thank you both. Okay, there's a question from a couple of people asking, will we have a version 3 Gaeilge? So we don't have plans at the moment to produce one, but as teachers may or may not be aware, we do have a version of Gaeilge, Oleocht Reactanach. Apologies if I completely butchered that, but it's a full suite, it's a full teaching package available as Gaeilge for the Gael Colossi, and certainly get in touch with us if you were not aware of that, and if you'd like to take a look at that. Okay, so and I suppose much of the presentation today was about looking at the exam and the different questions that feature in it, and approach to answering questions. And there's a point being made here that you have to be very exact with your definitions to get full marks. Would that be correct? And how might we cater for that in essential science?
Yeah, absolutely. They must be absolutely clear. You know, I gave some examples there in my talk. They must be able to describe at the boiling point. You know, they must have the word throughout the liquid. So the definitions are very important, and that's why throughout the book we've highlighted all the key definitions in the green boxes. The students must know their definitions. They must know what a physical change is, what a chemical change is. Because remember, if they're asked to distinguish between two things, just tell the students, give the definition of either one of them. In the revision book accompanying the textbook, we cover sort of exam hints and tips like that on how to interpret what the words mean. But certainly they need to know their definitions very clearly.
Yeah, and we just catered with that, with just definition boxes and that to highlight it. And as a teacher, you will always have to have some starting point, and the definition is your starting point before you can build on top of that. Okay, thanks, Conor. Next question.
Thank you. I'm conscious we're running a little over, but if people would be kind enough maybe to wait a minute or two, we'll get through some more questions, and I'm getting through them as quickly as I can. Seán, this is to you. Do the students need to know the 8 essential physics equations off by heart?
They do, in fairness. Yes, they do. They're the least they have to know. Now, not off by heart. They can use the maths tables they can use the maths tables for them, but some of them are definitions themselves, like speed, etc., density. They're actually definitions as well. So they're the 8 essential. They have to know those. They will be asked those right throughout the exam. I can guarantee you they'll be asked 2, 3, or 4 of those in every single exam. Okay,
thank you. Someone has asked if the PowerPoint from this presentation can be shared, as it's an excellent resource. Well, there's no plans to share it, but there will be a recording of this webinar sent out to all attendees, so you can take a look at it. And if you would like to get your hands on the PowerPoint, I don't see any reason why not, and feel free to get in touch with us, and we can look to share that with any teacher who might want to look at it. Okay, physics section, Seán, you're up again. Are Sankey diagrams covered in a chapter in the new book?
They are covered in energy. Now, they were never specified in the specification, and when the question came up in Sankey diagrams, they were explained to the students. So now they are covered as part of energy.
Okay, great.
So there's
Okay.
a specific section, you see the annotated diagram there, which showed you how to write one and how to create one for yourself.
Brilliant. Okay, so then I guess this is to you, Declan. In a titration using methyl orange, is yellow accepted for the base instead of orange and pink for an acid instead of red, as it is in the Leaving Cert chemistry paper?
Yeah, yes, generally speaking, it is. They don't insist on particular shades, you know. So if a student said pink instead of red, that's all. And I marked Leaving Cert chemistry papers for over 20 years, and those shades were always accepted on the marking scheme. So yes.
Okay. There's a question here. I think it's the second time someone has asked us whether the new edition of the book is on Folens Hive. It's not on Folens Hive currently. There's plans to upload that over the summer. But if you go to folens.ie and search for Essential Science second edition, there is a flip book available for you to take a look at. And that includes all the pages of the textbook. Okay. I'm just thinking, is there any more coming through? Declan, how does chemistry in the new junior cycle prepare students for Leaving Cert compared to old junior certificate?
Yes. Now, one of the key foundation stones for chemistry is, of course, chemical bonding. And the word chemical bonding does not appear in the new specification, most unfortunately. However, you cannot teach the writing of chemical formulas without covering chemical bonding. So I included chemical bonding in both the first edition and the second edition for two reasons. Number one, because they needed to understand chemical formulas, and number two, because they need it as a foundation for Leaving Cert chemistry. So my advice to everybody is teach chemical bonding, teach ionic bonding, teach covalent bonding, in order to try to help them to bridge that gap. Now, there is that gap, and I think it's generally realized throughout the country that the gap between junior cycle science in both physics, chemistry, and biology has widened. I mean, we look at biology and we say, where's our plant biology gone? So likewise in chemistry, there are some fundamental concepts gone in chemistry, like, you know, the test, you know, burning sulfur in oxygen, burning carbon in oxygen, and so on. All these tests are all gone, unfortunately. So the gap has widened, but we have tried in Essential Science to keep the gap as narrow as possible within the confines of.
Yes, and I suppose Rose might agree with me that we've done the same in physics and biology, but of course we have to keep it focused on the junior cert science as well. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. There's a question here, or there's a point being made from somebody about us not showing any of the PowerPoints that we've updated for the second edition of Essential Science, because I know that some of the feedback from teachers on the first edition was that maybe we needed to flesh them out a little bit more. We just, as you could tell, we're running over, so we didn't have time to cover every single aspect of the teaching package. It's so comprehensive, but to that teacher and anyone else who maybe wanted to look at the revised PowerPoints that we have created, we've got a great, much more fleshed out set of PowerPoints, which I think you'll be able to use more meaningfully in the classroom if you teach via PowerPoint. And if you again go on to folens.ie, search for Essential Science second edition. If you go to that web page, there will be a link to 4 or maybe 5 PowerPoints for the different strands, which again I think will provide evidence that we have upped our game and really improved the PowerPoints that we've created, because we know, even though they're quite a basic digital resource, PowerPoints, particularly in the world that we're living in and remote teaching and so forth, have become very important. So to that teacher, that they do exist, they have been improved, and if you'd like to take a look at them, please do on folens.ie, and if you have any feedback on them, we'd welcome it. Maybe the last question, folks, I'm realizing that we've run way over, it's 7 minutes over now. In relation to the termly plans, are the learning outcomes included in the termly plans in the teacher's resource book?
Yes.
I'm not sure. I think that are they? I can't remember.
Yeah. In the teacher's resource book, at the beginning of each chapter, we reproduce at the beginning of each chapter dealing with this particular strand, we reproduce the learning outcomes in a column of a table, and next to it we show where each of those learning outcomes is covered in the particular pages of the textbook.
Yeah, and in addition to that, so we recommend as teachers to do a chapter, and at the end of every chapter there is enhanced, more clearer learning outcomes at the end of every chapter.
Right. Thank you very much. And I think that's it. We've covered pretty much everything. I'm just very quickly before I close up, I want to make sure that I've addressed everything that's come through to us. I think I have, and I do apologize if I've missed any questions. We will come back to you on anything that I'm not noticing here, or I haven't passed on or haven't responded to. So, with the hour being 8 minutes past 8, I think that's what they call, that's a wrap. So Declan, Seán and Rose, thank you so much for such a comprehensive presentation. It's greatly appreciated. And to all the teachers who joined us, all the many teachers who joined us this evening, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule, particularly on what was a lovely evening, that you decided to stay in and participate in this webinar with us. I hope you feel it was worthwhile and that you learned something from it. Again, if you have any questions after this webinar, please get in touch with us. We'll be happy to answer any more questions that you might have. So I think that's it, really. All I will say is just enjoy the rest of your evening. Oh, I'm sorry, does somebody want to say something there?
Sorry, Conor, I just wanted to thank you as well and Folens. When we were working with you, you pulled out all the stops. Anything we wanted to, it was just done, and that was fantastic, Conor. And you've pulled out all the stops, and I have to congratulate Folens for doing such a great job. Thank you. And thanks to the team as well for participating.
Here, here.
Okay, so that's great, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Stay well and goodbye.
Bye, everyone.